on new media dramaturgy. He's published very widely in that area, just was involved in a large international research project as the co-chief investigator of that, and is also published widely in global performance, in modernist and avant-garde, and particularly Japanese. So that I will now turn it over to Peter Eckersall. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, David, and thanks. Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd just like to also acknowledge David and Sarah for your curatorial practice and your work in organising this seminar. I'm going to talk today about the concept of new media dramaturgy, which is, I mean, it's easy to be an expert of something when you invent the term. But it's a term that was invented by myself, Edward Shear, and Helena Grayhan, arising out of a study that's funded by the Australian Research Council, also involving Micah Bleeker and Maren Blažević. And so, as you can probably tell from my accent, I come from Australia. I now work at City University of New York. I've been there 4.5 years, but I still work largely on collaborative research grants funded out of Australia, Asia or Europe. And one of the features of those grants is that they're very often team-based grants, and they involve certain kinds of collaborative practices, sometimes between artists and scientists, sometimes between humanities and the arts, and so on. And so I just acknowledge my partners in what I'm about to talk about today, and also to further acknowledge work done by colleagues here on the artists that I'm talking about. Catherine Mazur, long-term collaborator of mine in the Japanese world, has contributed extensively to the work on dumb type, and she's a contributor to a book that we co-edited last year called The Dumb Type Reader, and also Sarah Bei Cheng's contributing to a volume on Chris Verdonk, which will be published hopefully in the early next years. So, you know, there's a lot of, I think, people contributing to the ideas that I'm presenting today, and so hopefully we'll be able to have a very productive conversation. Wonderful talk this morning, and I think there's a number of intersections with what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to offer a kind of three-part presentation. I'm going to historicise new media dramaturgy a little bit, then I'm going to talk specifically about two case studies, one old NMD, which is the work of dumb type, and one newer NMD, which is the work of Chris Verdonk, and then at the end I'll probably just raise some questions that we might take into the discussion this afternoon. And also to say that this morning I'm talking a little bit more with my kind of scholar hat on. This is coming out of a series of publications that we've done, but this afternoon we'll be focusing a little bit more on some of the work that we both do as dramaturgs and curators in relation to NMD, and bringing that conversation of practice more closely, which was very much a feature of the presentation this morning. So hopefully it'll all come together and we'll be able to make some productive synergies between really, I think, concepts of, you know, research concepts around new media practices and the performing arts, and also some of the practicalities around that and how we work as scholars and artists, and, you know, where the intersections are, the productive intersections are. So part one is the idea of NMD, and I'm just going to begin with a clip, if I can work it. It's a very elaborate way of doing this because
just the lighting
yeah.
As Ashley was saying, machines are now too smart, and so I can't run a PowerPoint straight out of my PowerPoint. I can't run it.
There is a little software called Live Slides that will let you do this.
Well, somebody will have to teach me that. Yeah. And the playback's beginning shortly because, sorry, this has all happened about 2 minutes ago because it was all working fine before. And it's decided it doesn't want to play it now.
See if you refresh the... Under the lighting. Yeah, it is on the projection lighting. Oh, it is? Oh. I think... Yeah, those are on for the projection light. There we go.
It's a very old documentation, so it's very fuzzy. This clip is, it's an amazing clip by an amazing company, but it's important to the idea of NMD because this piece was premiered at the Adelaide Arts Festival in 1994, and at that time I was a young PhD student also stringing for the national broadcaster, doing radio shows for companies that were coming from Asia and touring into Australia, and I was sent over to the Adelaide Festival to interview Untitled about their new work, and I walked into the theatre as they were setting up for this performance, and it's the first time I saw laptops in a theatre, and, and down the front were 4 or 5 people with laptops programming the kind of video feeds that they were using to run this show. And so 1994 gives us a certain liminal moment, I think. It's about a certain kind of technological evolution that enabled, as we interviewed the technicians for the dumb type reader, and they spoke about the difficulty of hot wiring computers to talk to data projectors. And they said that at the time a computer only had a printer port. And so these technicians who were members of the dumb type collective effectively worked out through hot wiring the machine how to make it speak to a data projector, which was not like the one up there. It was one of those massive things with the 3 lenses that you had to triangulate and do all. So it's actually an important work, not only because of its artistic content, but also for the narrative about technology that it tells. And so this is, in some ways, one of the beginnings of NMD. And is it going to do this again? Sorry, you can see all my notes now.
If you just want to go to...
How do I get... I want view, yeah. So it's a very unseamless technological process. So, what is new media dramaturgy? New media dramaturgy is a framework for both analysing and creating contemporary new media performance, including multimedia theatre, dance, video performance and installation arts. We're very much talking about a range of contemporary performance practices that evolved somewhat in relation to this technological narrative that I've just identified, very much in relation to the possible use of data projectors, video projectors. And in fact, we could actually go back earlier into the 1960s, and you were talking about the art and technology work. And from there, you could go to Osaka Expo, where there was the Pepsi Pavilion, featuring the EAT people projecting a 360-degree movie, immersive filmic environment featuring the Buto artist Hijikata Tatsumi, for example. You could also go back earlier, I'm sure, but you know, we have to begin the story somewhere. And for us as a research team, this moment of the laptop somehow proved to be a very fruitful moment for beginning the investigation of this project. So NMD is theorising how the synthesis of new dramaturgy, which is a term I'll come back to in a minute, and new media have changed the experience of live performance for the spectator. And it's noting the turn towards visuality, intermediality, and the blurring of distinctions between performance and installation art. We're constantly watching works in the kind of NMD framework, in the kind of work that you were showing this morning, that are very conspicuously working between the concept of live performance or theatre and visual arts and installation practices. And moving forward, we can also see now, I think, a remarkable engagement with these practices in the more conventional theatre framework itself, where we're very often seeing theatre artists and playwrights such as Okada Toshiki, for example, or Richard Maxwell, using techniques that have been developing in these kind of installation practices to create much more affective, immersive spaces in the more traditional theatre or live performance context. So, we're interested in tracing that kind of trajectory, but also making arguments about how these transformations have taken place and their impact on the processes of making work, the politics of making work, the experiences of embodiment, and also the materiality of the work itself. We're interested very much in the way that the forms themselves become intrinsically or dramaturgically a part of the experience of the work. So the field of performance is now situated in between dance, theatre, music, and visual arts, and how we can trace that kind of practice. So it began with a question, and it's a very important question asked by the late, very influential dramaturg Marianne van Kerkhoven, who was one of the foundation members of the Kai Theatre in Brussels, which was an early concentration of hybrid inter-performance style artists bringing theatre, dance and visual arts and technology into a live performance space. And Marianne coined the term new dramaturgy to describe the kind of new dramaturgical work that would be needed for this kind of interactivity that they were developing, around about the 1980s and 1990s. And she wrote in an essay in 1994, she said, "Is there a dramaturgy for movement, sound, light, and so on as well?" And by asking this question, she's drawing attention to the need for dramaturgs, people who've traditionally worked in relation to structures or textual questions or the drama of a piece, people who've traditionally looked at the relationship between form and content, to expand their vocabulary and expand their practical applications of the work that they do, and start to think about a dramaturgy for movement. Well, now we have dance dramaturgs, lighting, sound, and so on and so forth. And the evidence of the need for this, I think, is now evident in the kind of proliferation of dramaturgical roles that we now see in contemporary performance practices. The term, in a sense, has become so ubiquitous that we're no longer quite sure what the term means, where people suddenly do a little bit of work on a show and don't quite know what to call themselves, so they call themselves a dramaturg. But nonetheless, I think that kind of proliferation of the term is in fact very productive, because it makes people think about, with a stronger awareness about how a process that articulates an artwork is very important to what happens in the evolution and development and delivery of that artwork to an audience. And that itself is very dramaturgical. So Marianne van Kerkhoven she was very often asking questions about things that dramaturgs traditionally had not asked questions about before. She was interested in the possibility of a dramaturgy of things, and she was interested in a dramaturgy of spatial relations. She was interested in the dramaturgy of spectatorship. She was interested in the dramaturgy of aesthetic intention, and she was obviously interested in a dramaturgy of aesthetics, a dramaturgy of work. She made works and then she wrote about how those works were made. in writing about how those works were made, she very often interviewed and presented the contributions of people who are usually never asked in a creative process how work gets made. She would interview intensively the lighting designer and the lighting operator and the sound operator and the dancers and the performers and the stage managers, and she would see all of these composite tasks being brought into the theatrical space as being very important, and she would make the work of those people much more visible than it traditionally is in the theatrical or performance process. Van Kerkhoven's idea of new dramaturgy is hybrid, interactive, and political. And, you know, it's hard to sort of say that there is one equation for this. In her extensive writings, which unfortunately only a few key works have been translated into English. She wrote mainly in Flemish, a little bit in French. She's articulated various perspectives on, for example, the relationship between art and the political through a dramaturgical lens, very often pointing to the importance of things like the need to be alive to the importance of complexity in an artwork. And she would say that the job of an artwork is to keep things complex, to present a certain kind of complexity to an audience. Whereas traditionally, perhaps, maybe in a very banal way, the role of the dramaturg is to come into a creative process and to straighten it, and to make it less complex, to make it clearer in terms of its intentions to an audience, to straighten the kind of lines of flight that work through a work and the dramatic intensities of a work. Sometimes, in a very unfortunate way, this practice is called script doctoring, where the dramaturg ambulance arrives and tries to save the production from mortal failure 2 days before it opens. That's not the kind of work that Marianne van Kerkhoven was talking about in her conception of the term new dramaturgy. She was talking about a series of long-term creative relationships that a dramaturg would have with a creative artist, where a dramaturg would be somebody who would bring a breadth and a range of material to the creative process, where that material would inform the development of the creative work, and where the dramaturg would be present in the development of the work and give feedback on the process and development of the work, and then ultimately be one of the people, and not the only one, who would then write about the work and talk about and debate the meaning of the work for and with an eventual audience. So this is a much more expanded understanding of what new dramaturgy means, and it's the kind of concept that we've very much taken into our study of new media dramaturgy. At the risk of taking you through a technological disaster again, I'm going to show you a second clip, a second departure for NMD as a concept, and so we'll just click out of that, and then we will go here. Sound. So this work, Mortal Engine, made in 2008, so a considerable time after SN's work, but with a much greater integration of technology, is by the Melbourne-based company Chunky Move, choreography by Gideon Oberzanak, and the interactive system, the visual system that you're seeing there, is by Frieda Weiss. The reason I'm showing you this work is because the production manager and stage manager, Lydia Teichenet, who's a friend and colleague of mine, was telling me about the difficulty of making this show because as the stage manager, she had no vocabulary to call the show. It was a new thing. There was no way you could articulate the cues in the conventional Q1, Q2, and so on and so forth. So they came up with the concept of cue black shadow go. And so when the black shadows appear out of this interactive system, this is one of the first times that you have in real time this mapping of live dancers moving through the space, that data being connected to an interactive system which is giving instructions to vary lights, which are varying their intensity and their frame and their shape, and also data projectors that are tracking the dancers and enabling that, you know, very clever and very kind of spooky atomized effect of bodies sort of disintegrating into data, and at the same time these massive shadows moving across the stage and seemingly obliterating the presence of the live dancer. And so this idea of cue black shadow points to the fact that a lot of work that's being made with the new media interactions require new processes, new technical processes to run the shows. And so there's something really nice about cue black shadow, because anybody who's ever worked as a stage manager knows how their training is so exact. It's either 10% or 15% or 20% or 9%, and the timing is very precise. And typically, if you're running a complex show, timing is everything. And then suddenly, ironically, with this mediatized intervention, we have a very fluid and very flexible, durational kind of experience that the stage manager has to deal with. And so she's talked to me quite a lot about, we interviewed her for our book, about the difficulty for stage managers of dealing with this kind of work and having to, in a sense, remap their own protocols and to deal with a kind of what the Japanese in the 1980s beautifully calls fuzzy logic. It was their term to sell fridges that had little computer chips in them and things like that. But you know, fuzzy logic is a way of extending on the kind of very rigorous implementation of a kind of data protocol and giving it a certain kind of fluidity, a certain kind of flexibility, and extension into something that is much more helpful and sensitive to the needs of contemporary artists. So this idea of interactivity that we're talking about in cue black shadow, and we saw in the Chunky Move example from 2008, is a key idea to NMD. Just a couple of caveats. We are not really talking about the kind of popularity of, you know, there were various experiments with push-button theatre where, you know, the theatre would get to a certain point and then you'd be asked to key in responses, and if you know, the majority of the audience put in number 3, the text would go in a certain direction. We were not really looking at that kind of work, and we were actually really thinking that that kind of work was a very unproductive engagement with the possibilities of new media in performance. A much more kind of, I don't know, I'd call it banal, but I'd also call it something that is much more relating to certain protocols within television game shows, in fact. And that kind of interactivity, I think, is really, because it doesn't work on it's not really using the media for its intrinsic aesthetic presence. It's therefore not a part of the new media dramaturgy, as far as we could see. We also didn't look at you know, the visual screen headgear and that kind of interactive work, not because it, you know, potentially there would be a future study, I think, for NMD in that relationship. It's a field that I think is evolving now, and people who are tracking, I'm sure you've been following some of that in your work, but it's a, you know, we're seeing theatre companies engage with this technology increasingly, I think, in interesting ways, but we're not, you know, we're still not quite at the stage where people are actually doing something really interesting with the work. I mean, people might want to disagree with me there, because I think there are some people who are very strong advocates of this kind of work. But, you know, typically, I question the kind of assumptions about interactivity in relation to this kind of headgear. They're deeply held assumptions by people who make that kind of work, but I think if we step outside of the kind of fascination that they have for the technical protocols, well then I think another set of questions open up about, perhaps as you were saying, the limits of a kind of new media possibility in the performing arts. Instead, as Rosie Klitsch and Ed Shear argue, contemporary performance uses new media as a means of aesthetic innovation. So we need to think about new media not as a trick, not as a kind of a consumer choice in the theatre, nor as a kind of just a kind of magic trick, but it needs to lead to some kind of aesthetic innovation. It needs to be intrinsic to the meaning of the work and to talk about that relationship in a very fundamental way. For the experience of that, and also the way in which we theorize this as a kind of materiality or new materialism, I just want to show you now this kind of intensely annoying work, but beautiful work. Anybody who's ever experienced Eckersall's installations will know that the experience is material, it is biopolitical, and it directly affects the body. He and his team of musicians and technicians are using sonic frequencies at such a level that they activate the kind of sensory experience of the body. They are pieces that, in a sense, invade the sensorium of the body at the level at which one might think of, you know, particular frequencies create sonic disturbances in the body. The classic one is the fingers on the blackboard becoming something that is not so much heard as felt and reacted to viscerally. And Eckersall's really doing that with his work, with a lot of very low frequency sound effects, but here in this work, Transinfinite, this is all activated by the spectator. There are no professional performers in this piece, which we might call theatre, or we might indeed call it dance. But the work is engaging with the presence of the spectators and tracking their movements around the space and triggering this very intensive light and sound experience that he's created. Ikeda, by the way, is the composer who made the soundscape for SN, which is the piece that we began the presentation with and we'll be returning to in a minute. And I'll tell you more about that piece. But what's very interesting for me about Ikeda's work is it very strongly makes the point that what we're talking about here is a kind of dramaturgy as a form of materiality. It's something that is interactive and immersive, but it is present in a very material way. It's present as a kind of materiality. It's present in the sense that it operates directly on the body. And so it's taking us to some questions that are raised in philosophies of new materialism, certainly taking us to really interesting questions about biopolitics and the way that politics interacts with and operates on the body, and perhaps interestingly prefiguring questions about the role of data in shaping our understanding of the world and you know, in a sense programming our bodies in certain ways, and of course taking us to a lot of important writing about the experience of affect in live performance. So NMD is not a conventional dramaturgical media framework. Dramaturgy is historically linked to ideas of linearity, progression, of story arcs, ordering space and time, coding forms of expression, and so on and so forth. And it's about, in its traditional sense, creating drama and understanding what that dramatic intensity is. Post-dramatic theatre, which relates much more to the world that we're talking about, is relating to contemporary performance and connected to new thinking about dramaturgy. It's about networks, connection, matrices, machines, and what some scholars have called the productions of certain kinds of proto-subjectivity. So certain kinds of new subjectivity that are residing inside us, part of our individual understanding of what subjectivity might mean, but also building a bridge into this kind of environmental world that the human moves through, and creating a certain kind of new form of subjectivity arising out of that kind of interactivity with the world. And so the kind of works that Ikeda's doing, or indeed Dumtype or Chris Verdonk in a minute, are very much exploring those kind of bridges. So new dramaturgy after Van Kerkhoven dwells in the complexities of multiform processes, hybrid performances, and new politics of presentation. And I want to come back to that question of presentation in a minute, and talk about the politics of this work after we've seen our case studies. Just before I move to the case studies, just some of the terms that we've looked at in our study more broadly, and the reading will address some of these, and the book that we did was looking at works, and indeed the chapters were organised around some of these kind of NMD type effects. And so they include things like smoke and fog. And again, you know, you were talking a lot about how artists are working in a technological way without being technological. And I think this relationship to smoke in the theatre is one that has become really interesting, because it's produced through a highly mediated and technological environment. The technicians who create these effects, you know, I'm thinking of Okada Toshiki's God Bless Baseball, where in fact, you know, we move out of a kind of fairly conventional documentary style play into pure affect through an installation effect using smoke and water and mist, and this is happening a lot in theatre. And these are not necessarily kind of reading as technological moments, but they're produced through this materiality of form. They're produced through this interaction with technicians and artists and creators who are shifting out of a kind of dramatic, conventional dramatic register into a way of communicating with the audience through devices and effects, new media effects. So I think that's a very important consideration, which we might bring up again this afternoon. Even the most basic space now in a theatre is a highly mediated space, highly technological space. when I went to drama school in the 1970s, we had the protocol, we had to learn every task. And so we did acting, but we also had to take a technical task on the production, so we did lighting and sound. And I'm sure that I could not work a lighting board now. I'm sure that I could not even program a light. You know, we used to, you know, it's become such a kind of incredibly advanced technological site, and even the most, you know, kind of low rent venues have these kind of have this equipment in them now. So, so you know, I think what we're talking about here is not only a kind of artwork that's made by artists that are drawn to more mediatized or more technological kind of work, but we're talking about almost an ontological condition of theatre, in that theatre now is mediatized. So I'm sure you had, you know, I know you had Phil Oslander here last week, but those kind of debates that people got very anxious about 15 years ago, well, they kind of seem like that was a very prescient kind of argument that he was making, but now we don't even question that kind of argument. It's just seemingly so much a part of what we understand theatre to be, even the most conventional types. So, part 2, case studies for NMD, old and new. I showed an example from Dumtype's work from 1994 in the beginning with the invention of the theatre with laptops, and I'm just going to go back to that company and take you through a trajectory of technologies and form and politics over 3 works that they made from 1989 to 1998. So really about 8 years or a decade of advanced technological innovation in the theatre, but also you can see the relationship that they have to technology is changing. So in this, by the way, this company began in Kyoto around about 1984. It was a collaborative, a collective of people who were studying visual art at the Kyoto Art School, and it was a collective of visual artists, dancers, architects, cultural theorists, musicians or composers, and activists, people who are interested in various kinds of activism around, mainly around sexuality and gender, but also issues around information technology, urbanization, and so on and so forth. And they were a really remarkable collective, a kind of loose-knit group of people with a number of very key and important core members. They initially made works that were mediatized and interactive, but in the realm of installation arts that were presented in art galleries and had audiences, but their first major presentation for a theatrical space or performance space was 1989, a work called PH. And what we see here is a kind of giant photocopier or scanner where the audience are sitting on 3 sides looking down into this very clean technological space, this white surface, and continually throughout the performance there are moving 2 scanner beams, one above head height, which is the top one we can see down the bottom of the frame, with a bank of not data projectors, slide projectors, analog slide projectors. And then the other one, which we can see up at the top end of the space, was about this high off the ground and had essentially a strip of white light pointing down onto the surface. So very much like the experience of a photocopier or a scanner. 1989, scanners were very new technology. And there was a kind of idea about, well, what happens when you scan something? What happens when you copy something? What happens when that is turned into a kind of digital process, so out of analog into digital? And this work, PH, mainly explored questions of informationalization and the body. And it was, you know, somewhat, this is, you know, postmodern theory of the time, inscriptions on the body. There was a lot of Michel Foucault's ideas informing this work, Elizabeth Gross. And, you know, for a lot of the work, this top scanner was, this top bank of projectors was projecting global icons or money or maps onto the bodies of the dancers and the performers, who were regulating their performance according to the movement of the scanning beams. The three women that you see here, their dances, their choreography was always worked in relation to this low scanning beam, because every time it passed, their choreography meant that they either had to be lying down so that the scanner could move over them, or that their choreography would take them into a sequence of jumping over the scanning beam. And Catherine's actually written about this work quite a lot, so I refer you to her work, and maybe you can contribute to the discussion about it this afternoon if people are interested. The interesting thing about this is that it's pre-digital, or one of the interesting things. It's quite a remarkable work. It's not interactive, in the sense that there's no real-time mapping of people in space, and there's no real-time connecting that experience into some kind of technological effect. It's all analog, and it looks like a digital performance, but it's all fake. They faked it. Because you couldn't do that kind of work at the time. They would build this machine wherever they toured, which took 2 days to bump in. It was a big thing made out of scaffolding, so it's kind of classically old analog work with brutal kind of machinery and a very impressive machinery display that's driving this kind of image of the scanner beam back and forwards, which when we interviewed the technicians, it was a terrifying proposition because it always broke down. And so it kind of interrupts the sort of seamless presentation of the work. As you can see, it's an incredibly beautiful work, and it's a remarkable work for its presentation of gradations of light, and also the way in which the visuality of the work takes over from the presence of the live performers at various times. And there's a very strong relationship between body and image, constantly in relation to each other in the piece. And it's, as I said, its thematic was very often addressing dystopian ideas of scanner codes and barcodes, and the idea that people might be losing their individuality or their sense of subjectivity in this newly emergent informational economy of the 1989 era. 1984, though, we already saw the scene from SN in the opening image, but this work was made after one of the founders of Dumtype, Teiji Furuhashi, wrote a letter to his company members announcing publicly that he was HIV positive. And the company had not explicitly engaged with a kind of gender, sexuality or AIDS agenda until this point, but that letter instigated a research project, essentially, that the company undertook. 1994, we're still, and particularly in the context of Japan, there's very little discussion about AIDS, and in fact there's a kind of pervasive silence and silencing of AIDS-related illness. There's no safe sex advertising or anything like that. It's just basically ignored. And so the company themselves engaged on a research project, and SN, which was the work they developed, had several manifestations. One was a symposium that involved medical professionals, sex workers, AIDS activists, and artists, and they would present scenes from the work and sequences from the work while also engaging the audience in educative discussion. And then this work, which they premiered at the Adelaide Festival and then toured to several other places, was really a very interesting and clever elaboration of, as you said, a dive into the experience of illness, the AIDS illness in particular, featuring a series of remarkable images of these medical scopic images of the body being interrogated for illness, various kinds of experience of suffering and fear, but also generating this text of radical solidarity and love. Not all members of Dumtype were queer or are queer, and not all members of Dumtype were necessarily at the time well educated about issues of sexuality, gender or AIDS. And this piece brought them together in that way, and they made a very strong utopic statement, ironically, or ultimately, very much coming from, I think, Furuhashi's own quite remarkable charismatic personality, which ultimately explored the kind of scientific, medicalized and political side of this, but made claims towards a kind of radical utopia, using texts, I dream my sex will disappear, I dream my gender will disappear, I dream my illness will disappear, and so on and so forth. And quite a remarkable and outstanding work. And you know, we really, importantly, I think we have this really very strong relationship between the media, the ability to present this media in real time, and the politics of the work. So it's a really dramaturgical, it's got a great dramaturgical clarity for the way that the media speaks to the message of the work. And this work, I think, has been very influential in new media performance circles. The final work I want to show you from Dumb Type is a work, OR, which they made in 1997, so some 3 years after SN. And it's a work that was made as a homage or a memorandum, actually, to Teiji and his life. And it's a work that posits to explore the border between life and death. And you know, it's a very beautiful work. It's a work that really uses integrated new media technologies in a very remarkable way. This is the first time that Ikeda Ryoji started using subwoofer surround sound, putting speakers under seats that were activating the spectators, vibrating the body literally. It's a work that used stroboscopic lighting systems to create you know, for some people quite disturbing lighting effects that were again really literally affecting the sensorium of the body. And it's also a work that created some remarkable images using new forms of lighting that really did convey a certain kind of experience or an imagined experience of what it means to die. What is the border between life and death? Is there an experience of life flashing before us, as in that was staged in this beautiful sequence down below, where this woman literally stands in front of a depiction of a car travelling over the French Alps down to the sea in slow motion and then increasingly sped up time? Or is it something much more about the relationship of the medicalized body or the cyborg body? And it started to introduce these new, very fresh for the times concepts in a way that could only be explained and could only be communicated to the audience through very, very interesting new lighting, which was kind of grey lighting. And I'm happy to show a clip for that later, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move on. So, second case study, slightly newer NMD, or very new NMD, the work of Chris Verdonk. Now, Chris, I first came to Chris's work through Marianne van Kerkhoven, who for many years was Chris's dramaturg, before she passed away only 2.5 years ago, or 3 years ago now. I was initially asked to do an after talk with Chris at a PSI conference, and so I said yeah. It was we were given a 10 p.m. slot in a pub, and I thought we're really going to get killed here. You know, it's like, you know, everybody was drinking and everybody was noisy, and you know, nobody wanted, you know, they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and I thought we're just going to get killed here. So anyway, we went on, and people were silent. And you know, Chris is a lovely presenter. He's an engaging presenter, and he's got beautiful work. And so since then, I've developed quite an academic or scholarly relationship with Chris, but also started to work a little bit with him artistically as well. And his current project is working on a kind of cyborg null play. So I've been working with my Japanese theatre hat on as somebody who's been giving him some help with that. But Chris is an artist who's based in Brussels, in Belgium. He has a company called others.The. He trained both as a visual artist and as a performance maker. And for his whole career, he's really made his own works, which are in a kind of border zone between visual arts, where he makes objects that are displayed in artistic contexts like gallery spaces or theatre foyers, and then he makes fully immersed and fully developed performance works, and a kind of spectrum of works between those two. So he works with projections, he works with sound, he works with objects, and he works with live performers. And one of the important, or two particular things that Chris talks about a lot. One is the concept of the uncanny or the unheimlich, which he and Marianne, it was really Marianne's project, I think, in life to bring a much more politicized, or as she always said, I'm 68 generation, but she very much disliked the kind of way that the uncanny had been completely colonized by a kind of psychoanalytic circa 1975 kind of cultural politics, and she wanted to bring it back into a conversation for theatre artists, because what she wanted was to return to the kind of idea that the uncanny brings to a theatrical space a very unsettling experience for an audience. And so Chris's work is always motivated by this idea to unsettle in a radically, politically, potentially productive way. And Chris's work sometimes involves the audience directly, but very often it's not a direct kind of immersive thing. It's about making works that are communicating to an audience some kind of sensibility about the uncanny in this very unheimlich kind of way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Chris is very much motivated by Heinrich von Kleist's essay on the marionette theatre, where there's talk of the figure. And one of the things that Chris talks about in his work is that for him, and I think for a lot of many other contemporary artists, figures operate in the theatrical space compositionally and also collaboratively. So figures include for Chris the human performer, but also the object. And so very often his work is playing with this certain kind of leveling of a distinction between human and non-human forms. On the other hand, it's also playing with our desire as audiences to project onto figures various kinds of desire and various kinds of stories, and our own engagement with figures is can be very profound. He's not buying into the kind of uncanny valley kind of theory, Mori's idea of the theory that teaches us that the closer the object gets to the human, the more unlikable it becomes for an audience, or the creepier it becomes for an audience. But if I got that right, yeah. But he is very much buying into the idea that in the 21st century, we have developed very intimate relationships with objects. And in talks, he always says, well, the iPad is typically the only object that people take into their beds with them. One of very few objects that people actually sleep with now. And so we have this very intimate relationship with objects, which can be quite creepy, because when you actually say it like that, you go, oh, all that radiation kind of sitting there right next to me, it's a bit spooky. But that's something that his work is very often exploring. The early installation works include two here. The one on the upper part of the screen is called Box. And one enters a white space. It's a white-walled space, like a white gallery. In the middle of the room is an object, a purpose-built object on a stand, which is a white cube, somewhat that size. And it looks very much like an old, you used to get those Instagram Kodak cameras with those little cube-like flashes that you could twist around. They had 4 sides, and it looks very much like a giant version of that. It's dark, it's not active, and as the piece begins, there's a text from Heine Müller being read by the actor Johann Leysen, excerpts from the text Media Material, about life in the suburbs in eastern Germany. It's horrible. And gradually this machine starts to glow. And it's actually a partnership between engineers and artists, because he worked with the evil Dutch corporation, the Philips Corporation, to make this special object which glows infinitesimally brighter from completely off to the most intense light that is blinding, and one has to put on kind of welder-style glasses in order to protect one's eyes. And that's the work. The audience basically experience light and the power of light, and the point, and the point at which various people resist putting on the glasses, I guess, is captured in the documentation of the work. But you don't want to delay it too long, because you will damage your eyesight. And there's this idea of, this, again, the physical property of the saturation of light. What is a dramaturgy of light? Well, there's a very clear example in this work where it completely saturates you. You can close your eyes, but that's not going to help, because it just simply passes through the eyelids into the retina, because it's so bright. A similar work was once made by Eckersall, actually, where we had a soundscape for 6 minutes which invaded us, and then we went into a white room, and then we were blinded. So it's kind of cruel work. The second work here is two actors, one man and one woman, in large glass containers filled with water at body temperature, so it's very comfortable to be in for the actor. Saline solution, they can open their eyes and keep their eyes open, and they don't blink. Their clothes are weighted so that they don't rise up, and then they have a breathing apparatus. And basically the audience walk around and observe these actors performing, and it's kind of uncanny. I'll show some video perhaps this afternoon. And people find it both fascinating and disturbing. So these are early examples of this very uncanny relationship that he's trying to the audience, that he's trying to capture in his work. An interesting work to consider is Actor 1, which is a 3-part work that puts together 3 individual components of works that he's made into a narrative of theatre. One views this work in a theatre, moving from the foyer space into an internal space, a theatre, and then another part of the theatre. To intensive purposes, we're moving through a theatre to 3 parts of the theatre, and we're seeing 3 scenes of what are, for the purpose of this work, conceived as a complete work, even though these works are also shown individually as separate works. In the first scene, we have mass, and it should work. Don't touch anything. So we have in a dark space, in the middle of the space, a quite large construction which is containing somewhat mysteriously this experience of mist, lit beautifully by these, with a cool blue light. And the mist never escapes the borders of its container. In fact, there's a lot of work hidden to make that happen. And we have an experience that clouds. It's very meditative. It might look like the ocean. I mean, people can left free completely to process this work in any way they seem fit. But the point is, Chris is arguing that this is theatre. He says this is part of theatre. That sequence goes for about 20 minutes, and it slowly builds in intensity, sort of beautiful dramaturgy of intensification. But then it doesn't conclude in any overt dramatic way.
Dangerousness.
And then we move into the second room, and the second scene is called Humanid, and it's the actor Johan Leysen. But it's not really, what we see
Dangerousness. Figment, light becoming pale air. The dead dust timeless in that silence. Earth, soil similar pale as the air. Oxygen, breathing, standing still, a corpse. Cells of grey soil. Silence. The soil, similar grey matter. Earth, pale corpse breathing. Grey surface incorporates a mitogenic radiation.
So the actor is reciting text from Beckett, and he's being filmed, and then that filmed image is projected onto a third-sized sculptural form of his body. And it's a remarkable likeness, and it's also relatively three-dimensional. It's constructed in such a way that, you know, we can't go behind it to see the shadow. And it's an image of an homunculus, a medieval fantasy of a small person that is very much dealt with in text by Dante and other medieval thinkers, and it's slightly at times out of register intentionally, so that there is a blurring and that we become aware of the fact that we're watching a mediatized construction. The third piece is called Dancer 3. It's not going to work. Let's see if it loads. So Chris has made a number of works that are called Dancer, Dancer 1, Dancer 2 and Dancer 3. Dancer 1 was an early series of works that he did where he got a regular power drill, and instead of a drill bit he put in a kind of 45-degree angular piece of metal. He put it in a lighting grid, lit it with a spotlight, turned it on, and the thing spins around crazily until the engine burns out. And then everybody applauds. Dancer 2 is actually a car engine that we'll see an image of in a minute, which is without its gearbox and obviously without the car. And it flies in, and it actually, they've worked out how to turn it on. And so it belches fumes and it makes a huge noise. It's not muffled. And so Dancer 2 is the V8 engine. And Dancer 3 is this beautiful, there we go. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to flick through to final set of slides. So moving now to, again, 2008, Chris made one of his perhaps most ambitious and operatic works, End, which is an attempt to stage the experience of the end times. And recently, Chris's work has been largely concerned with questions of the Anthropocene and questions about the experience of climate change and how we might deal with that and think about that and respond to that. End is a highly dystopian work in which a number of performers repetitiously move through the space performing a singular action. And I won't show you the video now because I don't have time, but I can show it this afternoon, or indeed you can look on Chris's website and see this work. But it's a fully immersive, mediatized space. There's a screen dividing the stage from the audience. There's a projection of acid rain or grey snow coming down. And inside that space, various performers or figures perform repetitiously dystopian experiences. Johan Leysen moves across the stage in a kind of phone booth, reciting text from Beckett and Cormac McCarthy and various kind of dystopian texts. Another actor falls from the flight tower onto a crash mat, gets up, repeats the task. Another actor performs dragging a body bag across the stage and looks very agitated at various times, sometimes dragging the body bag, sometimes carrying it over her shoulder. Another actor who's harnessed has this seemingly strange experience, strange ability to extend and distort her limbs in really very disturbing ways, all enabled by the harness and so on and so forth. The show goes for about an hour. Each of those actors are performing roles that have been researched and represent different historical relationships to the end. This was the last work that Marianne worked on with Chris, and they wrote a book called Listen to the Bloody Machine, which really very strongly articulated the work that that they'd done on that project, and this is where they did very detailed interviews with all of the people involved in the project. Most recent work, Conversations at the End of the World. 5 figures stand on the stage, and basically they have inane conversations, snippets of text from various sources, including the poetry of the Russian surrealist Daniel Hymes, Samuel Beckett again, a little bit of Heine Müller. These are Chris's favourite go-to people, and he constantly just takes these little snippets of text and interweaves them into the performance. A concert-level pianist plays snippets of modernist compositions, and seemingly without any concern in the world, they fill the time by talking and by having inane conversations, telling quite silly jokes, and then halfway through the performance, the snow starts to fall, and it doesn't stop for about 45 minutes. It's an incredibly beautiful, engaging, absorbing kind of experience to watch this. And they're gradually buried in this kind of image of grey snow until the piece ends not in a catastrophic way. They just disappear, and so it's a very strong statement, I think, about what Bifo Baradi's called the phenomenology of end, where humans experience the end, and we're living a kind of end time, according to him, and it attempts to stage that reality in a very beautiful way. And I'm very interested in the problem of beauty here, because this is an extremely disturbing work. It's a work that is really engaging us with asking very strong questions about the politics of environment and climate, and yet it's also a work that lulls us into this incredible beauty and sensory experience. So that's something we might take into our conversation. So closing comments and questions. NMD already rewires performance in relation to elements of time, duration, repetition, and enactment. It works with robotics. I'd love to show you Hal saying, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that," but I'm sure you all know that. It's somewhere between machine and image. It's between what Marion van Kerkhoven calls, in relation to Verdonk's work, the need to listen to the bloody machine, and it's what Shikata Yukiok describes in relation to Dumtub's work of media performance as the image machine. And finally, just a couple of things it can do or maybe cannot do. In drawing attention to materiality and technology as agents in the process of making meaning in theatre and performance, it is necessarily dramaturgical. Dramaturgy, I believe, is hugely important to the future of theatre. NMD is about better understanding the experience of theatre, more visual, affective and multidimensional, and understanding these qualities. It's leading to questions about how theatre relates to audiences and speaks to and about politics, how it provokes important discussions and/or is about a new kind of politics. For theorists, there are new relations to philosophy and politics, including affect theory, new materialism and post-Marxist notions of assemblage, network and apparatus. These in turn address deep structural questions about humankind and society. And for artists and thinkers of art and politics or art and society, NMD artworks are often drawing attention to and raising questions about two of the most important and essential issues of our time. They're drawing attention to questions of big data and the transformation of society and the rise of technological capitalism, biopolitics and maybe what we could call informational authoritarianism. And they're also drawing attention to the Anthropocene, eco-criticism and what is increasingly becoming the end of winter. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
All right, and so we can have a few questions now, and then we'll be, of course, meeting for seminar all afternoon, so a lot more time then. Thoughts, questions for now?
Yeah. This could be this afternoon too, but one thing for sure, we'd love to get your slideshow, because some of those statements are just so powerful. Thank you so much. It's just really disturbing and uncanny and wonderful, so at the same time. But I'm curious about the idea of, and this is a word that's come up, about collaboration and collectivity. Because in all these works, although I know Kirkhoven was working with Chris, and I know that different people worked with Dump Type, but I'm curious about how this new media dramaturgy is also a collective form. And that would be different from someone who's, working and staying there over 6 months, working with a piece, because there's not always one person. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, because there never is one person. And very often the person who's named is the least technologically literate of the team. So Chris actually can't make anything. His technicians, who he works with as creative partners, invent them. He in a sense, he's able to, his art practice is to imagine the possibilities for these things. And he will go to his team with an idea and they'll work out how to do it. Or if they can't work out how to do it, they can't do the idea. So yeah, and it's a bit like Andrew Schneider. I mean, you name a company after an individual, but there are a lot of people who are actually making the work of that person possible. Yeah. And when you work inside those companies, those artists are very valued, and I don't think there's a question of they're just wanting to be named on the bill. They're in the naming of the company. I mean, it's still the central artist who creates the kind of the logic or the characteristics of that company's work.
You think so?
Yeah, and I mean the technicians are also in demand, and they move around a lot because they can do pretty amazing things.
I guess for me, there's the politics of that naming. I know many of the choreographer or other people may not be on the bill, but I think it changes the idea of the canon. And I feel like when we talk about this collectivity in new media work, new media performance, that we also in some ways need to change who gets credit. and whether they're named or not, that there's something about the collective
So
work.
yeah, I agree with you, but let's be clear, they're always named in you know, if you go to the work of where the website or the program, they're named in the same way that a choreographer is named in a program of a more conventional work. And they're named, you know, they're known throughout the community as well. I mean, the question is, Dumtype were established dramaturgically as a kind of radically inclusive collective. Chris Verdonck's company was not. And so you have companies that are motivated to work in that kind of collective way, and you and I both know how difficult that's been for Dumtype. You know, really ongoing difficulties, because of course inevitably there are various offshoots and fragmentation of that collective ethos. But the collectivity of the company was certainly there at the outset. Other artists who make this kind of work are not proposing those kind of collective structures, but they draw on and use, and I mean, part of the ability to make this work is to attract the best technicians in some respects who can do this kind of work as well. You know, there are probably a dozen or so technicians around the world who are highly in demand for this kind of work. Yeah. And I'm not even sure technician's the right word to call them. You know, yeah.
I know it's lunchtime, but and this is something I'd like to discuss this afternoon, is this term affect and mediation.
Yeah.
It's something that I've been working with, and I find the more I study, the more I'm confused about it, right?
More confused, sorry.
Affect with affect.
Yeah.
And the work you showed is incredible. I mean, it's breathtaking to look at. So that's something I'd like to maybe expand on this afternoon.
Yeah.
And you know, just very briefly, what I find really interesting in terms of the politics of this kind of work is the way in which artists have found the need to move out of this kind of, I mean, I'm talking about artists who've traditionally worked with textual frameworks, and how they register in the middle of a performance into the visual and the medial, and precisely to communicate experiences that can't be communicated to the audience through the more traditional framework. If you want to kind of give somebody a really bad feeling about the environment, you can write a text about it, but audiences won't respond to that. You show them something and they go, man, that's hard. You know, so,
yeah, this is more like, also just want to kind of put on the docket for discussing later. I don't want to get in the way of people's lunch. But I also want to say that, yeah, it's a beautiful collection of work, and some that I was familiar with and some that I was not, and that I hope maybe the ones that you didn't show us, that we'll have a chance to at least see them briefly this afternoon, because I personally would love to make time for that. My question is one to sort of think about the complicated, and this is mentioned in the reading, but the complicated relationship with these technologies. This is something I'm thinking about a lot in my own work, because I did an immersive performance at my college a couple of months ago, and we paired with the immersive media program, which is entirely funded by the military. And so thinking about what is sort of our ethical, political engagement with these technologies, and when are we responsible for, as artists or scholars, in tracing the origin of the technology, and and how do we acknowledge that? So sort of, again, not something to necessarily answer now, but maybe something to bring up for the discussion later.
I'm really struck by that image from E, very famous image you were showing at the people crowding the armory, and explicitly placed in the image is the car from the US military. And yeah, I mean, relationship between technology and military, but increasingly too now, I think, because that was very prominent in the Cold War. But now it's the relationship between technology and data companies, and they're, what we're learning now about the way that politics is shaped by data, at a neurological level even, I think is something new we have to factor into this. Some really interesting work around that we could talk about this afternoon around responses to the Fukushima catastrophe that are dealing explicitly with these issues. And also, I'm working with an artist as a dramaturg on a project that's based around the Arctic Circle. And on one hand, we're looking at the kind of climate change experience of that, but also the degradation of the landscape, because all of the Cold War, there are 14 nuclear reactors buried up there from nuclear subs, and about 26,000 rods, nuclear rods buried in, it's because it's a vast empty landscape, you just bury it there. So there's this incredible legacy of Cold War technologies that that this particular artist is working to elevate. So, yeah.
So this is probably a question for later, but I think about this as a playwright, the relationship of how writing performs in this kind of work. And I understand the move from the text-based to these other modes of generating work, but I'm really curious about the way that writing can perform in and with these works. And it seems interesting to me too that some of that writing seems to then move to the outside, to the dramaturgical frame and to the theorisation and to the rings around the work. But there's citations. I mean, I see a lot of the time that text is taken as a pre-given object, like figures and other things are, and put in. And I'm just wondering what writing does and what writers do in dialogue with this work.
Yeah, I think these are one example of basically turning writing into a form of citation, as you say. But I think there's also very interesting examples now of writers who are interested in what happens to language in the kind of world that we live in, a kind of industrial, capitalist, technological world. And I can think of three writers, Okada Toshiki, Richard Maxwell, and Carol Churchill, all in their recent works have done incredible writing, poetic, textual writing in plays about language in this kind of space, and created, I think, very important contributions. So, it's too easy just to say, oh, this is after the playwright. It's not about that kind of split at all. And all of these artists, well, Dumb Type didn't work with playwrights. They were not that kind of company. But many artists work still have very, I think, productive partnerships with playwrights in producing this kind of work. Or indeed, they're a playwright director who has a particular vision for their work, like Okada or Maxwell. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks, this is great. One of the things that your work has been getting me to think about, I've read it before and it was nice to revisit here, is the way in which the idea of the dramaturg is evolving and changing.
Yeah.
And it's beginning to feel to me that we're almost looking at one possible model of dramaturgy, which is we might call distributed dramaturgy. Right? So we may have a person who's coming in who's sort of the dramaturg, but what they're really doing is providing opportunities for articulation, helping other people to bring their technical knowledges into some form of common language, so that there's a distributed dramaturgy, so that all members of a particular group are doing what they're doing in their own languages, being critical, being historical, thinking about the material, the ideological implications. It even feels to me, in the kind of question that Jonah was raising, that one of the functions of the dramaturg, or this distributed dramaturgical model, would be that everyone spends their time thinking about where the money's coming from, the implications for their own practice, and so on. Is that idea of a distributed dramaturgy application?
And I agree. I think what we're talking about here is a very interesting conversation about the differences and the interrelationship between dramaturgy and dramaturg. Dramaturgy is everything. Every live performance arguably has dramaturgy. Every context that you bring to the theatre, and increasingly every context installation project has dramaturgy. And of course we know that people have written about dramaturgy in the city, and sociologists appropriate the term to describe human behaviours and so on and so forth. So there is always dramaturgy, and people in an artwork who participate in an artwork produce dramaturgy. They can't escape doing it, because their very participation in the process means that they're involved in you know, making these material contributions to the making of a work. And in making those contributions, they're embodying or they're representing or they're making a technological process for the representation or the presentation of an idea, and that's dramaturgy. A dramaturg is somebody, and I think in the traditional, perhaps in the US sense, was seen very much as somebody who was aligned with the work of the playwright. Whereas if you come from a more devised context, you see a dramaturg who is distributed across a process of performance making and is involved in the various stages of that process, but is not the artistic director, and is not the, you know, is somebody who is between those processes and somebody who is very often has a role to bring a certain kind of research, a certain kind of perspective, a certain kind of overview, not necessarily a deterministic one, because they're not the director of the work, they're not the writer of the work, they're somebody who is helping that vision to that process and enlivening that process. We'll talk more about that this afternoon, because we're going to talk about some actual work that we do as curators and dramaturgs, and how you negotiate that in different contexts. And but yeah, it's a very interesting idea. But I do think that everything that we see in the theatre, and I mean, I increasingly use the word dramaturgy to describe all sorts of things. You know, yeah.
All right. Well, with that, let's we will meet in the lobby at 12:35. We're going to be walking down.